Welcome back to Parenting Roadmaps, a video series providing parents with short weekly videos focused on childhood development. This week is week number 5 of the preschool series. As I've stated before, keeping track of developmental milestones is important to make sure your child is developing as expected. But I also believe it's important as parents to know about these developmental achievements because sometimes they are, 1, actually easy to miss if you don't know to look for them, and 2, some of these milestones can seem fairly basic, yet they are so much more than what we can see on the outside of the body. Walking, potty training, now those are milestones that are really hard to miss and are often very much celebrated, right? But today's skill, crossing the midline, you might be tempted to ask, what's the big deal? I feel that I'm your tour guide of sorts on this journey. So as your tour guide, I'm here to tell you that crossing the midline is a big deal. In fact, we are going to stop our tour bus right here and spend 3 weeks on this topic. It sounds so basic to cross the midline, but it really is beautifully interwoven into so many aspects of your child's development. In fact, I'm going to link it back to the topics that we've already discussed. And as we move forward, you're going to hear about crossing the midline time and time again. This week we'll answer the question, what is crossing the midline? Next week, why is it important? In the third week, what can you do to support its development? We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. What is the midline? The midline is simply an imaginary line drawn from the middle of the head down to the space between your feet that separates the body into the left and right sides. That's it. Easy enough. We're moving on. What is crossing the midline? Crossing the midline is the ability to use a body part, an arm or a leg, to move to the other side of the body across the midline spontaneously and easily to do an activity. Crossing the midline also involves the eyes and their ability to visually track or follow an object from one side of the body to the other. There are a gazillion things we do crossing the midline, but just to name a few: swinging the bat, simply crossing your legs or ankles, sweeping, and reading from left to right. How does crossing the midline develop in a child? As we all know, in the very beginning, most of an infant's movements are their reflexes. Early on, babies have little control over their body movements. As infants develop, they begin to gain control over some movements, but at first it's one-sided, typically grabbing for an object with their left or their right hand and playing with it on that same side of their body. Next, you're likely to see a child move a toy from one hand to the next, with the handoff typically happening in front of their body at the midline. The progression is then followed by a child using both hands to play. This skill of using both hands together is known as bilateral coordination. We're going to pause here for just a second and break down bilateral coordination. Stop for a second and think about the different ways you use both of your hands to do different tasks. You can break down bilateral coordination into different categories depending on what the hands or the legs are doing. The hands or the legs can do similar actions like tossing a ball, pushing a swing, or making funny faces. Or your hands and legs might be doing alternating actions like pedaling a bike or crawling. A third category would be when one hand or leg has a main job and the other hand or leg is assisting. Cutting, for example, when one hand uses the scissors and the other hand holds the paper. And filling a cup with sand, one hand is for scooping and the other hand is for patting it down. One other skill involved with bilateral coordination is, you guessed it, crossing the midline. What you start to see is the combining of a child's ability to use both hands in coordination and a child's increased interest in exploring the world around them. So early on, you may have a child who has just learned to sit up all on their own using their strong core muscles, and the child reaches across their body to play with a toy. Now, just because you've seen the child complete the act of crossing the midline doesn't mean you get to check it off the list and move on. As we will discover next week, crossing the midline continues to develop until a child is 8 to 10 years old. So you might be wondering, really? They keep developing this skill until they're 8 years old. And yes, this is because there is more going on with crossing the midline than what we can see on the outside of the body. Next week, we will see how crossing the midline plays a key role not only in physical development, but also in brain development. We will begin to see the beauty of how this skill is really interwoven into so much of your preschooler's development. So a little bit of homework for this week. Hopefully sometime this week, you'll need to put on a pair of shoes that need lacing. Instead of doing the activity without thinking about it, tie your shoes slowly, paying attention to how you cross the midline and the level of coordination that's required between your two hands. Notice how something that we do so easily is really quite complex. That's it for today. Everyone have a great week, and as always, remember to enjoy the journey.